Good afternoon, Patriots. This is the American Vision, broadcast on the TLBTV network and brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Project. I'm your host, Bill Muckler, and I'm coming to you from my home studio in Cocoa, Florida. And today I have a special guest, one who I really enjoy talking with, who's really an expert on a lot of things that we really need to start learning about. And that's Dr. Ileana Johnson Paugh. And Ileana, welcome to the show. And I might want to also bring up the idea that, or the fact that Ileana has written 5 books, and her first 2 books were on communism, and she's also written a book on Agenda 21. And that's what we want to talk about today is Agenda 21, because the American people, actually people around the entire planet, really need to understand what this United Nations Agenda 21 is all about. So Ileana, welcome to the show, and it's so good to see you again.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to see you too, and thanks for having me again on your show. I'd like to start, if I may, with a quote from our president, Donald J. Trump, in a speech that he made in Biloxi, Mississippi this past weekend. He's actually the only American president in decades who recognizes the danger of the global communist assault on our sovereignty, an attack which was launched and escalated by the UN Agenda 21, now they're calling it Agenda 2030, with help from various non-governmental organizations or NGOs, Hollywood actors, particularly prominent ones, academia, corrupt politicians of all stripes at all level of government, but especially the Democrats, and the of course, the last but not the least, the anti-American news media. And this is what our president has said, and I quote, "We will not answer to donors and lobbyists or special interests, but we will serve the citizens of the United States of America. Global cooperation, dealing with other countries, getting along with other countries is good. It's very important, but there's no such thing as a global anthem, a global currency, or a global flag. This is the United States of America that I am representing. I am not representing the globe. I'm representing your country," end of quote. I thought it was a very, very seminal paragraph that should be quoted over and over in all the news media. Unfortunately, since they are so much anti-Trump and anti-America, this is not going to be quoted. But it is very important and will be quoted probably later on as part of the history of America, in my opinion.
That's really refreshing to hear our president say that. And it sounds like he really understands that the planet is not going to be great because 195 dictators decide to make it great. They're not going to really do anything for the United States of America. In fact, it seems like the whole object of the UN 21, Agenda 21, is to take away from America. And so it sounds to me like what President Trump is doing is he's really trying to protect us as Americans, and we really need to start realizing that.
Yeah, of course. I just want to mention to you that this idea of one world government or one world order has started actually a long time ago. But if you look at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, the history will show it clearly that it has escalated as decades had passed. If you look at our currency, just on the dollar bill, featured prominently under the Masonic pyramid are the Latin words Novus Ordo Seclorum, which translates as the New World Order. if you remember the Rhodes Scholarship, I think I mentioned it last time you and I spoke. Cecil Rhodes of the Rhodes Scholarship, he dreamed and believed that the entire world should be governed by the British Empire. And his organization in the 1891 Society of the Elect, he also called it the Secret Society, which turned into the Chatham House Gang, was the beginning of the global governance idea. Colonel Edward Mandell House, House, he was Woodrow Wilson's advisor and chief negotiator of the Treaty of Versailles, had a following of like-minded individuals who formed a group called the Inquiry. This group met with the Chatham House Gang, and they decided to formalize their group into a common goal of globalization. The Chatham House Gang became the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England, and the Inquiry became the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, which is in this country. President Roosevelt, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, for example, issued a, quote, Declaration of United Nations, end of quote, the first time such term was used in an official document. And according to his son-in-law, Curtis B. Dahl, and I quote, most of his, that is Roosevelt's thoughts, his political ammunition was carefully manufactured for him in advance by the CFR One World Money Group. And of course, people don't have time to read history anymore or such documents. Going back to 1961, United States introduced a program calling for all nations to transfer their military power to the United Nations. In 1972, in Stockholm, Sweden, and you know what's happening to Sweden today, they're being overtaken by third world immigrants. So in 72, there's a UN conference on the environment. And at this conference, the infamous Canadian Maurice Strong became the director of the newly created UN environmental program. Of course, Maurice Strong has passed away since then, I think last year, or maybe the year before, I can't remember. But he was very prominent for many decades after this United Nations Environment Program was created, because everything they have done was coached or covered under the pretense of protecting the environment. In 1976 in Vancouver, British Columbia, there was a conference on human settlements, which actually produced the first steps towards this global governance, with about 65 pages on land use, how land should be used. And that means not just government land, but privately owned land. And for those of you who know enough about Agenda 21, the number one problem in this country referring to Agenda 21 today is property rights. And at this conference, I quote, public control of land use is indispensable, end of quote. And of course, the recommendation that appeared in this conference were implemented in the US as sustainable development, which is the linchpin of Agenda 21, sustainable communities, smart green growth plans, as mandated by comprehensive land use plans. And if you look in every state in our nation, there is a comprehensive land use plan for a certain area of the state. And they all have very euphemistic, non-threatening names. Now in 1983, the World Commission on the Environment, under the aegis of Gro Harlem Brundtland, she was, and I believe she's still today, the vice chair of the World Socialist Party, introduced the term and the definition of sustainable development, which is being used today. Every organization at the local, state, or federal government has sustainable development plan in place. And now there are sustainable development chairs, professorships at universities. They are even advertising cosmetics that they're sustainably developed, medicines, anything you can possibly imagine that we use in this economy, it is now advertised as sustainably developed. And the definition, if I may read it to you, seems very benign, but it is really collectivism. It says, quote, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, end of quote. Well, most people are not going to object to this definition because it seems right that we fulfill our needs today so that future generations, our children and grandchildren, can also fulfill their needs. But the problem here is who is going to decide what our needs are and who is going to tell us that? And having lived under communism, I know that the elites have told us how much we could eat, how many calories we could consume, where we could live. And pretty much under this Agenda 21, everything that we do in our modern society is deemed unsustainable. So once they take completely over, they are going to tell us what kind of development, or should I say de-development, we are allowed to make. And finally, and I'm sorry if I'm taking so long with the history.
No, go ahead. This is fascinating.
In 1992, the UN Conference on Environment and Development took place in Rio, Brazil, including the United States was one of the participants. There were actually 10,000 delegates and 30,000 NGOs or non-governmental organizations present at this conference. That's how important it was deemed by the left, by these globalists. And they produced 3 documents at this conference. One was the UN Agenda 21, which was presented as a soft law, not a treaty. Then the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was a treaty. And the third document was the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was also a treaty. 178 countries signed Agenda 21, including the US President then, George H.W. Bush. He signed 2 documents, but refused to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity because he had problems with proprietary concerns because the United Nations wanted to transfer technology and any kind of proprietary secrets of a corporation to the third world for free. It's like you giving away any kind of intellectual property you have or you create your entire life for free to everybody else in the world. I have found a video which was dated October 2nd, 1992 in the C-SPAN archives. I don't know if it's been scrubbed since then, but I think I kept it. It shows discussion on the House floor about Agenda 21, in which both Democrats and Republicans are in favor of conforming fully to the recommendations of UN Agenda 21 document, in spite of the oath they took to defend the US Constitution and the sovereignty of our country. There's a younger Nancy Pelosi who introduced a bill to follow the 1992 Rio Earth Summit to conform to UN Agenda 21, the local sustainable community practices, and to follow international law. Well, she was never held to account for this, and I found it that that's when our legal system started faltering in a terrible way, in my opinion, because this Agenda 21, which has 40 chapters, and we discussed some issues with that, limits the behavior and freedoms of both individuals and firms involving every facet of human life.
So, Ileana, as you're talking about this, and you mentioned Nancy Pelosi back in 1992, that was 26 years ago. So the Democrats, I know, have been behind this Agenda 21 and promoting it. But who are the people that, you mentioned all the way back to 1891, and then you mentioned Woodrow Wilson and House, and I've read about a lot of this. But who are these people that started this, and how do they keep this? How do they keep this going, and that they can turn it over from generation to generation? Surely they're grooming young people or younger people to take over from the ones who started way back in 1891.
Well, some of the ones I've already mentioned, that vice chair of the Socialist Party from Sweden, different monarchs from Europe, bankers like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers have supported the idea, Cecil Rhodes of the Rhodes Scholarship. If you look at all the famous men who have received Rhodes Scholarships, and they have gone to England to study on these scholarships, they're all generally famous Democrats. Well, a few are Republicans as well. Others are just faceless, nameless politicians, both in the Senate and particularly in the House. And of course, a lot of very wealthy billionaires today subscribe to this globalist, and they pay a lot of money to advance the plans. And one being, and some of them donate money to these NGOs who work behind the scenes. And as you know, George Soros has had and still does several NGOs that actually go in countries such as Romania in Eastern Europe. Right after Ceausescu was killed, he boasted that his plane was the first one that landed in Bucharest after the coup. And he met with the Minister of Education, and all his minions in these NGOs started writing the textbooks that children, elementary, middle school, high school, and even college textbooks were written according to this globalism, global communism, global citizen idea. And there have been since then generations of young Romanians and other nationalities who came to study in the United States, and they are all rabid globalists, rabid communists, even though their parents had suffered greatly under 40, 50, 60 years of communists, depending on which country they're from. They are beholden to this man and to these NGOs for their college degrees and sometimes for jobs, because they do come back and work for these NGOs. I've met several Romanians in this country, in Washington, D.C., who are working for these globalist non-governmental organizations. What they're doing is they're promoting Agenda 21 and all its 17 goals of destroying sovereignty and just having one globe, basically. Some of the politicians at the local levels, they're just hapless individuals because they are lied to and kind of enticed with grants, which is free money coming from these NGOs. So that's how some of these comprehensive land use plans are being passed in some area, which fundamentally, in some cases, alter local zoning codes. And people don't really know about it. they present it as ideas coming from a visioning committee, but this committee is usually from out of town, sometimes from out of the country. And they come with a plan already developed and presented to the population as, oh, this is what the locals want. And the locals have never heard of it. But once it's passed by the board of supervisors, they have to abide by it.
As you're talking about this, when I wrote my book, 2020 Clear Vision for America, I had a chapter on the United Nations, and I talked about how destructive the United Nations is to the United States. And I talked about all the money, the billions of dollars that the United States grants to the United Nations, or, in a sense, funds the United Nations. And so what I'm starting to get the impression now as I read more and more about Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 is there's a lot of people working behind the scenes that we don't know who they are and we don't know what they're doing, but they're being funded by our money to write all these directives and all these policies that they want to implement worldwide. So really, what's happening is we the people are paying for this, and we don't even know that we're paying for it because the money has to come from someplace, and it's certainly not coming from Ethiopia or Nigeria or Guatemala or any place, or Venezuela, for example. It's coming from the United States.
That's absolutely correct. One of the most important parts of the principle of global governance is government control of land use, whether it's local government or state government or federal government. Another goal is population redistribution according to resources, and you're seeing this population redistribution, this social engineering forced by the United Nations Migration Agency, which consider these people from the third world that they are moving to first world nations as stock, as if they're cattle. They call them stock. I'm quoting their word use. So they are the reason this population, you're seeing this explosion of caravans and all this forced migration from nations that really hate us. Because this is part of the plan, population redistribution. Also redistribution from rural areas to the city, into mega cities. And you've seen the word perhaps in the media, mega cities, where you have mixed use, high rise, stack and pack miniature apartments with no parking, but easy walking from work, school, and entertainment. And that may sound attractive to young people who don't own cars and they're just into partying. They don't want to spend a lot of time traveling. But once you have a family, do you want to live in a 150 square foot apartment or even 600 square foot apartment, which is the size of an average hotel room? I don't think so. Then the government wants to control excessive profits that are deriving from land use, even your own private land. There are things that you can and cannot do to this land. Then you see springing up all these private-public partnerships or PPPs. That's another part of Agenda 21. Then you see a lot of regionalist authorities springing up. For example, in the United States, the UN has divided it, or the globalists have divided it into 12 regions. And some of these regions are already operating. They're called regionalist authorities. So it's like creating another level of government that was never voted on by the voting population, by the American population, and yet they become more powerful than local governments and more powerful than state governments, because sometimes they include parts of more than one state. Um, then mass transit is another stated goal of Agenda 21. They want to remove us from cars and put us into mass transit. And I live in a highly congested area, and even though it is so congested, they're still trying to take away width of roads and adding these bicycle lanes that nobody use. All these young whippersnappers who all voted for, oh, let's have these bike lanes, blah, blah, blah. They never use them. You see them driving alone in their BMWs or some other expensive, sporty looking vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the ones who are pushing this. Older people are not dumb to push bicycle lanes. I don't see anybody of any considerable age bicycling to work. And it's very dangerous in this area, frankly, to be walking across a road, much less bicycling to work. Of course, one interesting issue that I've watched, especially since Dr. Carson became Secretary of HUD, was the social engineering of redrawing neighborhoods to make them more diverse, according to the HUD directives that President Obama had put in place. And it states that it's social injustice to own land. The Seattle Mayor Ed Murray Advisory Committee on Housing had drafted a set of rules that would actually ban single-family zoning in Seattle. And he said we can still be a city for everyone, but only if we give up our outdated ideal of every family living in their own home on a 5,000 square foot lot. So they have built, particularly in California and Seattle and Washington State and Oregon, they have built apartments that have no parking, and they're really teeny tiny. They have no elevators. People have to climb, so you have to be in perfect health if you don't drop dead by the time you want to get to your 9th floor. And this is very much like the communist life I've experienced. We lived on the 5th floor. We didn't have an elevator. And yeah, we could climb the stairs, but I don't think we were in any better health if we had taken elevators.
And if you go grocery shopping, you gotta lug your groceries up 5 stories. And I can remember when I was young, they used to talk about getting a walk-up apartment, and I always thought a walk-up apartment, that sounds pretty cool, but that means you got to walk up all the steps to get to your apartment, and I don't know if that's really giving us a better quality of life, although maybe some of us could use the exercise. But this whole thing, we're talking about, in a sense, redistribution of population. I mean, we know that there's the elites in America want to redistribute the money, but how can they figure that we can? And I've read some of these books where some of them, like even Al Gore's books that were so popular about 15 or 20 years ago, that they talked about reducing the planet to a small group of hunter-gatherers, and they talk about depopulating the entire planet, and that seems like that's all a part of this Agenda 21 too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. If I may mention Mrs. Cristina Figueres, she's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. when she was speaking to a particular conference, these people meet like every 6 months or so, usually in very expensive locales where they live like kings. And of course, they have to fly and use fossil fuels. They're not walking or bicycling, and they eat expensively and drink expensively, and hotels are very lavish. They had set aside, for example, in Davos, Switzerland in 2015, $90 trillion. Of course, they don't have the money, but they hope to get it from people like the United States, who are being taxed to death already. So they set aside $90 trillion on redesigning all cities so that people no longer need cars. And she said, if I may quote, and by the way, she's a graduate of the London School of Economics. A lot of these people are graduates from the London School of Economics in England. And quote, in order to address climate change, which that's the tool they're using to scare people into submission, is to build a complex framework, the purpose of which is to facilitate and accelerate the actions at all different levels of government. End of quote. Well, I suppose in a United Nations dominated world, the global government would know best. The sustainable transportation and coffins will be stacked by the millions in these mega cities, because she presented a picture of people living in spaces the size of coffins, while residents will attempt to grow food on roofs and terraces. And Figueres said, quote, you will enjoy unlimited interaction and global cooperation, end of quote. Well, the buildings are supposed to capture as much water needed for the food grown on roofs and terraces of the building, Figueres said. I mean, these people are absolutely insane. A big economy like the United States cannot possibly function on all the solar energy that they provide or wind energy that they would provide. Most of it has to come, or the majority has to come, from fossil fuels. And what would be the benefits, in their view, of living in such mega cities? Well, Figueres said that we're going to avoid the catastrophic rise in temperatures. And never mind that we have entered into a solar minimum. Solar flares are a great contributor to the change in climate and temperatures, as are the currents, oceanic currents, volcanic activity around the planet. It has very little to do with CO2 emitted by humans. Yes, we do have a problem with trash in the oceans, and that is attributable to men, but mostly from third world nations that don't have a way to dispose of their trash. But anyway, that's a different issue. And of course, we even got snow in Cairo, and these people were talking about global warming. She said that we're going to have increased food security if we live in megacity, which is total madness. All the grain stored in the world can only last for 2 days in case of a worldwide catastrophe. She said that we're going to have increased energy security, increased water security. You mean from collecting rainwater? She said transportation security using electric cars with charge stations. Really, and where's this electricity coming from? It's coming from fossil fuels, natural gas, hydroelectric, and nuclear power. She also said that the low carbon model contributes to job creation, job security, and happiness. It safeguards natural resources for future generations. What future generation? Before or after mass starvation would be my question to her, if I could talk to her. And I have a degree in economics. It's not so highfalutin from the London School of Economics, but it's a real degree. And I understand economics and reality a lot better.
You certainly do. As I'm listening to this, I'm starting to think of the practical aspects of this. And as a consultant, I travel a lot, and every now and then I would stay in a high-rise hotel because that's where I was working. And there were times when you couldn't get hot water up to the 15th or 20th floor of the hotel because they just didn't have the capacity to do this. And I'm thinking about mega cities, and I'm thinking about, oh, we're going to have high-rise walk-up apartments that are 20 and 30 stories high, and I'm wondering, how do you actually get water to up to those top floors? And I don't think people are going to want to take cold showers all their lives, or do like when I was in the Marine Corps and spent a lot of time on Navy ships, where you take a Navy shower where you use the water for 30 seconds and then you soap and then you use 30 seconds to rinse off. I don't think people are going to want to do that with cold water. Plus the fact that I don't see how you can supply enough energy to these mega cities without having a plethora of power plants ringing the city and actually being inside of the city. And I've worked in a lot of power plants, so I think I really understand how power generation works. So this all sounds like it's academics or maybe political academics who are writing things that based on theory that have no basis in what we as Americans that are out in flyover country really understand about how things really work.
Yeah, I agree. We lived in, as I said earlier, on the 5th floor of this communist era concrete blocks apartment, and we very seldom got enough water pressure when we did get water because we were so high up. By the time we got steam heat through the wall heaters, it was pretty lukewarm, the steam, so we were always very cold. The people on the ground floor and the first floor, were a little warmer than we were. But yeah, and of course, living under communism, you have to ration everything because when you involve collectivism and a centralized communist party making decisions and economic planning decisions for the country, it always winds up in disaster and terrible shortages. So rationing has to be applied all the time. And of course, it's never going to work. It's sort of like these wind turbines. They don't produce enough electricity and they use a lot of fossil fuel energy to maintain. And unless the wind is 30 miles and above, it's not going to produce enough energy, storable energy. And the thump, 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 thump noise becomes so powerful to anything in the vicinity that people are having, and not just people, animals too, are having all sorts of unpleasant side effects, insomnia being the least of it. So much so that in one California town where they spend like $30 million to put up one such wind turbine, they had to shut it off because it was destroying the health in the vicinity of people, all that noise pollution in particular.
So what's the solution to this, or is this the topic for another show as we're running out of time?
Well, I'm not sure there's a solution. It has been implemented so far. By the time people they're beginning to wake up, but it's already has been rolling since 1992. And President Clinton at the time, he had actually passed an executive order, and I don't know if I have the number of this executive order handy, but it actually sped up the implementation of Agenda 21. It was the, I don't have the, yeah, it was 12858. directed all agencies of the federal government to work with state and local governments in a joint effort to reinvent government using the guidelines in Agenda 21. So since this was in the 90s, I'm not sure, once government is established, how much can you reverse in 2018? And additionally, if I may mention this also, a lot of these NGOs are environmental NGOs, and they have established themselves in areas, rural areas in the country, and they offered to farmers conservation easements or conservation covenants or agricultural easements, meaning that they sign a contract that will run with the land, and whoever owns the land cannot do anything to that land unless this NGO agrees and signs onto it. And most of them are written in perpetuity. They don't expire. And so people can't do, as I mentioned last time, collect rainwater or snow melt on their property. They can't grow healthy forests. They can't do anything except what this conservation easement contract dictates. So I'm not sure, Bill, if this can be reversed unless we pull completely from the United Nations. We did pull away from the Paris Accord that you saw, or our president did.
Mm-hmm.
You see all the backlash in the media against him for doing so.
And that tells me he must have done the right thing.
Of course. And one more thing, if your listeners would like to consult Dr. Kaufman's The Wildlands Project map. Dr. Kaufman, I think, passed away, unfortunately, last year. But it was developed in accordance with Agenda 21. And this map shows biological diversity, the former NAFTA treaty, and you can see what human habitation and passage through lands will be permitted if the United Nations gains total control of our federal land.
Well, that's the one thing that we don't want to have happen is the United Nations controlling the United States. We can see right now that having a large bureaucratic government in Washington, D.C. isn't working. So having an even larger bureaucratic government run by globalists and foreigners and NGOs is not going to work for the American people either. So anyway, I think what we need to do, Ileana, is we need to continue these conversations. So I hope that maybe we can get together and do another discussion, another interview on this topic in the future.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you so much for being on the American Vision and being such a great guest. I'm just in awe of the knowledge and the wisdom that you have in enlightening us as to what is really in store in the future if we don't do something to educate ourselves and stop these the elite bankers and politicians, bureaucrats, and globalists from taking over the United States of America.
Well, perhaps we can, Bill. Next time we need to discuss what perhaps we can do about education and how they are changing the minds of our children and grandchildren and influencing them to become global citizens and totally disavow their history and national identity.
Oh, I think that would be a fantastic topic. Okay, thank you so much for being on the show, and thanks to everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Okay, boys and girls, I'm back, and I want you all to get the book, United Nations Agenda 21, Environmental Piracy, by Dr. Ileana Johnson Paugh. And you can get this on Amazon or just about any place you can buy a book, and it's just a great read. and you really need to understand what's happening to us today. And so hopefully Dr. Johnson and I can get back together again. We can talk about education and more of this UN Agenda 21, and also get into UN Agenda 2030, which I've been doing a lot of reading and researching on, and finding out how the globalists want to take over America, and the goal is to have it all done, actually take over the world by the year 2030. So, and they started this a little bit ago. So they got a new 15-year plan that started about 3 or 4 years ago. Anyway, what I would also like you to do is start thinking about Christmas and thinking about getting 2020 A Clear Vision for America. Now, I've had people, they've ordered my book and they bought my book and they actually have me sign it. And I write an inscription that, you know, and I actually mail it to the person they want to give it to. So if you have a you know, mother, father, aunt or uncle, brother, sister, or child, grandchild, or whatever, I will actually write a note in the book. You know, I'll inscribe it and say, this is a gift from so-and-so to you, and put in something very nice and sign the book. So it'll be something that they can treasure forever. It's priceless. And I only charge $20 for the book. It's a $30 book that cost me a lot more than $20 and to get to you. And I don't charge you for shipping. I don't charge you taxes. I pick all that up myself because I don't like to pay that kind of stuff myself. So I don't want you to have to do it. So anyway, get the book. Tell other people, hey, if you're looking for a Christmas present, you don't have to go to a big box store. You don't have to fight through the crowds or anything. All you do is just go to my website and click, and it's there. It's very easy. We have a great e-commerce page on my site, on my web page, that, you know, it makes it so easy to do, and there's a lot of people have done it, so we know it works. So anyway, I just love to sign books, and I'd like to have everybody have a nice Christmas present. So think about that. Okay, thank you so much, and God bless you all for watching, and God bless Dr. Johnson for being such a great guest, and God bless all of our active duty personnel and our vets. And God save our America. We need you now more than ever before. And remember also, I have to tell you, where there is no vision, the people perish. That's Proverbs 29:18. So you have to have a vision, have the clear vision for America. Get 2020, a clear vision for America. Thank you all, and see you next time.